Hello, everyone. It is now 6 o'clock, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. I want to be sensitive to everybody's time. So welcome to our fifth session for the PcM PjM exam. This is the ARE CC California Study Hub. I am really glad you could all join us today. Whether you're preparing for the ARE divisions or the California supplemental, please take a moment, make sure you sign up so that you can stay up to date with any upcoming sessions that we have. So let's dive into today's topics. So a few housekeeping items. As you have noticed, you're all muted right now. Please hold off and do not unmute yourselves until called by me. If you do have questions during the presentation, feel free to write them in the chat, and I'm going to make sure we either cover them at the end or I will call upon you. Um, Again, as a reminder, please do not share any sensitive information that might violate NCURB's ARE candidate agreement. Do not mention anything you've seen in the test or heard of somebody else have seen in the test. And overall, we strongly encourage you guys to just be constructive with your comments and your questions just to help everybody get ready for these exams. I also want to take a moment and congratulate all those of you that recently passed an exam. If you have done so, please feel free to write it in the chat. Again, congratulations, everybody. These tests are hard, and we're really glad you're all pushing through and moving forward with your achievements. So now let's get started. My name is Magdalena Vraila. I'm the Young Architect representative for the state of California, and I will be moderating this session. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our lovely host now. Kevin, thank you for joining us. His name is Kevin Griendling. He's licensed in 8 states, which is a great achievement. And he's also founder of Intersect Arts, where art and science meet the architecture process. He's a former architecture professor, and he now mentors emerging professionals like you guys, formerly through Pluralsight and now through Preparatory, his ARE Prep series with AIA East Bay. With a broad experience across multiple practice areas, Kevin is committed to making license more accessible and empowering the next generation of architects. So again, I'm gonna go ahead and let him fill the screen, and you are all in great hands. As a reminder, please write your questions in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalene. Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin Griendling. So I've been in the ARE sphere for a good while now, and I'm going to start with kind of a macro look at the ARE because my impression is that a good number of y'all here today are relatively in the beginning of your journey. You may have not taken any exams so far, or you may have taken some and you're kind of still working through the final ones. Generally speaking, practice and project management lean toward, kind of newer people to the journey because they're more aligned with taking, sort of your prototypical test taking logic. But we're going to talk a lot about the test logic here in the presentation, but we're going to start macro and we're going to look at kind of the perspective that the exam has on the profession. And then we're going to dial it down into practice management and project management principles specifically. But to start, I want to introduce this idea of the continuity principle, and that has to do with the design process and practice in general. The continuity principle, sort of as I define it, is essentially that continuity of design from the first inception of a project all the way through to completion. And the perspective that that NCARB, the ARE as their product, and the architectural community at large generally has is that the continuity of the design idea should be congruent from the very beginning all the way to the end. And that means that the team members that we have that are responsible for the different phases of design have a working knowledge and a functional understanding of the components that go into each of the other phases that they might not be working in. So while our industry generally will kind of push people towards specializing in let's say being a designer or a project architect or a construction administrator, the ARE has a slightly different perspective than that. And so the continuity principle kind of highlights that as a bit of a sort of a generalist bias. Because we're not taking a test to become just a designer. We're not taking a test just to become a construction administrator. We're taking a test to become an architect, and that means well-roundedness. Um, Okay. I want to start off with a little bit of a story, actually, kind of from the early stages of my career. I had a designer come to me with this SketchUp model. This is an actual image from the project. And the designer comes to me. I was more of a project architect slash job captain at the time. And he says to me, "This is what we want to do." And I start doing some of the drawings, and I'm looking at these eave conditions and that ledge, and I'm just like, I don't know what the designer has in mind for this. And so I go to him and I ask him, I said, "What do you have in mind here? How are we going to do drainage and waterproofing and water control?" And so he comes to me with this. This is my official reproduction of the sketch that he brought to me. And he says, "I want it to look something like this." And I said, "What is that?" And he said, "That's for you to figure out." And generally speaking, it was a pretty shocking moment for me because that's not really what I understood being an architect to be. That somebody has a beautiful idea and then just expects somebody else to materialize it without any understanding of how to achieve that in the first place. Now, that doesn't mean that that's not a viable way of doing your career. It just means that that's not really the way that I bring this in, or I bring this to the table really to illustrate that that's not really how the ARE works. The ARE works in a way where we need to functionally understand everything that is required of us if we were to do those tasks and fill that role on projects as a licensed architect. So it really kind of ignores what your specific goals are for what you want to do in your job functions in the office, and it's focused a lot more on the broad profession of how we conceive of an idea and how we deliver on that idea. So that generally means that the ARE has a generalist perspective. The generalist perspective in the ARE is important because it approaches the exam with a high level of holistic design thinking. That means that we start at the widest range of how to deliver on a project, from the very beginning of conceiving of the concept of the idea and then carrying it through to the detailing at the end. And then when there's a challenge in construction at the very, very end, then the construction administrators are kind of responsible for also making sure that that design idea is realized. Generally, the ARE has this idea that having a generalist perspective improves coordination, and that just doesn't mean in the architecture office. It also means throughout the industry as well. So also understanding a bit about what the contractor does so we can relate to what they're saying that the challenges are on site. It also means having a functional understanding, even as a designer, of how HVAC systems need to be routed through buildings. So that dichotomy, or sorry, that relationship between all parties to the realization of a project is really important. Um, it also has a perspective of creating a stronger technical acuity across the board. So that limits mistakes, limits risk. Hopefully that leads to improved profitability, both for you and for your client, and greater success in the project overall. And then that also means higher quality documents that would be realized through having this generalist perspective, having a functional understanding in the beginning of how it might be detailed later on, and at the very end, having an understanding of where the design came from so that it can be realized all the way through. And then finally, quality construction administration. That's that last piece. So many design ideas just kind of get blasted in construction administration because the design idea is not communicated throughout. Now, how does that relate to our exams that we're talking about here today? We're talking about practice management and project management. The project manager specifically is right at the center of the project and the person on the project that has the greatest ability to make sure that all of these things happen. That actually is true of whether or not you work at a small firm where you wear many hats, or if you work at a very large firm where there are specialists that are doing design and documents and construction administration, because the project manager is there for the whole project, carrying it through. So that's design continuity. Um, Before we get into the sort of looking at some examples, I do want to take a moment to do a refresher on the background of the exam itself. But first off, we're going to talk resources. Resources for practice management and project management are going to be the simplest you're going to experience for any of the ARE, any of the exams actually, because practice management and project management essentially can be handled with just the Architect's Handbook of Professional Practice. That's the only real text that if you have to spend money on one thing for this exam, these exams, that's the one. Outside of that, we have the ethics documents, the AIA Code of Ethics, the NCARB Model Rules of Conduct. They're both free and available on their websites. The AIA contract documents are critical for this exam too. And then finally, I put this one with an asterisk and in italics because this one more relates to project management instead of practice management. But the CSI practice guides are great for a functional understanding of how a project manager will engage in the practice of architecture. So some background on the exam. I'm not entirely sure where everyone stands on their research into how the exam is structured. But if you did not read through the first few sections of the exam specifications for any of your exams in the NCARB matrix, it's really important to do so. That way you have an understanding of how the exam items are written and what they're challenging you to do in your understanding of our profession. So essentially, there's remembering at the bottom of this taxonomy, and then there's creation at the top. So everything in between is the process of going from remembering facts to being able to create something with information that you have. So that includes understanding and application, analysis, and evaluation. And so they're packaged in a particular way. This is called by NCARB cognitive complexity, so understanding and application packaged together and analysis and evaluation packaged together. So to refresh and put it in kind of simple terms, understanding an application is essentially using that rote memory that you have about these facts about architecture and functions of architecture in real world applications. And then analysis and evaluation is identifying relationships between related ideas, however remote, and articulating a functional meaning out of that. So what has to happen because of the analysis that you had? So I mentioned rote memory at the bottom of the taxonomy, and this is actually something that they've removed from former versions of the ARE. In ARE 4.0, there were questions that looked like this. What is the maximum slope of an ADA compliant ramp? 1 to 12. It's pretty easy to remember that. It's not really a functional skill that an architect needs to have. It's just memory. How it might look in an understanding and application leaning question. A client is planning a new project, emphasizes the need for a fast timeline. They also want the architect to continue representing their best interests through the project. To manage cost and schedule more proactively, they're considering bringing on a third party with no construction risk. Which project delivery model should the architect recommend? So you'll read the answer options and you'll pick the correct one. The important thing about this one is that understanding and application is exhibited by the fact that you have to have an understanding of what construction manager, agent, and at risk and design bid build and design build are and what they mean. So you just simply have to apply that knowledge to this question. Analysis and evaluation in a very similar question looks a little bit different. A municipality is launching a civic center project. Their main concerns are maintaining checks and balances in decision-making, advancing schedule and budgeting simultaneously with design, and keeping construction risk with a single accountable entity. The client initially favors construction manager as agent based on a recent case study. As the architect, how should you advise them? And so the answer options here, you are essentially responding to what action you might take based off of the situation that is presented to you. The correct answer being recommend construction manager at risk. So why is this analysis and evaluation? It is so because there's a situation that you have to evaluate, or rather, you have to analyze the situation and evaluate its appropriateness, and then select whether or not that is the correct or most appropriate answer or not. So in this case, it was not, and it was best to recommend construction manager at risk instead. So these are just very general at this stage. I'm just kind of mostly talking about the background of the ARE structure before we get into specific things about exam content. A critical element that I want to talk with you about today is kind of looking at the item distribution. And this is another thing that is available to you in the matrix if you're not familiar. There are, there's some information about how many questions are going to show up on the exam in these different categories, right? The different subcategories of the exam. So what you see here is finances, risk, and development of practice is the largest. It just happens to be the one that most people look at and they say, oh, I'm only 2 or 3 years into my career and I have not had to do a profit and loss statement. So I should focus on that because it's obviously really important and it's obviously the piece that I miss the most or like that I don't know the most. I need it the most. However, I would say that you need to look at these exam statistics a little bit more macro and have some awareness of what the exam is really asking you. If you think about it this way, business operations and practice methodologies, they combine for a total of 50% of the overall exam, which is a lot more than the roughly 32% of the finances, risk, and development of practice. But if you read the descriptions of business operations and practice methodologies, these are the two categories that really functionally test you on how you would run a firm. So operations being kind of your logistics and methodologies being your strategies. So, while you may look at these numbers and think your eye may be pulled directly to finances, risk, and development and practice really quick, essentially business and operations and practice methodologies being the lowest two categories often get overlooked, but they're an incredibly important pair of sections for this exam.
Kevin,
Yes.
really quick, we do have a question in the chat
Yeah.
about your previous example question before you go
Hmm.
to
Yeah.
firing.
Yeah, that's fine.
Um,
Yeah. Which one?
so um the the last one right before you switched over
This one
to the
here?
graphs, yes.
Hmm.
So the question is that there's two answers, except one of them has a risk check, and they would like to know what the difference is between the two.
Agent or at risk?
Correct.
Oh, okay. Agent essentially is a construction manager as a representative of the owner, while the owner still retains responsibility for elements uh, of the liability of the project, where construction manager at risk actually has risk involved because their responsibility for or they take on additional responsibility for construction schedule and the overall execution of the project. So they essentially it's a liability difference. Agent doesn't have any liability, whereas at risk is implying that they take on a certain degree of liability.
Great, thank you.
Mhm. All right, we'll move on. Um, so item distribution on project management is a little bit different than practice management. In this case, what you see here is contracts dominate the overall item distribution quite substantially. And in this case, I actually do advise that contracts be a focus of your study. And that's because contracts really do inform everything that happens in a project manager's day-to-day responsibilities. Early on in my career, I had a boss who was kind of taking me under his wing. He was project manager and taking me under his wing to teach me how to, the skills that a project manager has on projects. And so anytime I had a problem with what do we need to deliver to the client for this deadline, or which way do we need to write our specifications? And every time I came to him with a question, I mean, just about literally every time I came to him with a question, he would always respond with, "What does the contract say? What does the contract say? What does the contract say?" And that's how important a contract is to project management. It is the document that guides everything. It directly informs how we're going to execute on the project. It directly informs how we're going to manage project quality control, essentially, that includes what we're delivering and what should be included with it. And to a somewhat lesser degree, but still significantly, it has an impact on resource management and project work planning. That's because the contract outlines all of our deliverables. And as a project manager, part of your responsibility is to use our resources and plan how we're going to deliver on that project. So in this case, it's, if you look at these two exams at a macro scale, you can't really, I would not advise you to really approach them with the same logic of how you would tackle these subcategories of the exam. And then additionally, I want to just bring to everybody's attention that while there are formulas available, you can see in the NCARB matrix, they really only have formulas for structural, electrical, plumbing, and HVAC. They don't have any financial formulas, of which there's not that many. They also don't include building efficiency calculations, which are less important for these ones, but it is of note. So if you're studying for a concept that is not structural, electrical, plumbing, or HVAC oriented, and you're encountering something that is a formula, take a little extra notice of what that formula is and maybe write it down in a list of formulas that might be useful for you on exam day. And we will look at some of those today. So I'm going to jump into some sort of sample questions, starting with a couple of examples from practice management. And I'm approaching these with characteristics of the exam to help you understand generalities about how the ARE approaches testing your knowledge of functioning as an architect, and then also showing you how it might look on the exam. So here, I want you to take note of the fact that ARE items are adaptive. That essentially means that while there are things that may be literally appropriate by the text, there may be things that, because of the way we kind of do our work on the day-to-day, there may be some common sense approaches and common sense logic that we can use to interpret some of these questions. Here's a great example of adaptive reasoning. This question states, after the conclusion of a preliminary design meeting, other members of the design team raised questions to the project manager about the lack of inquiry into sustainable design strategies. The project manager, a licensed architect, responds by stating that based on their previous relationship with the client will not want to pursue sustainable design strategies. What course of action should the other members of the design team take? The options here are proceed with the project as agreed to in the meeting, inform an ethics panel in the project manager's jurisdiction of an ethics violation, consult a lawyer about a code violation on the project's design, or proceed with the project but incorporate high-end, active, sustainable design systems. So I want to point you back to the contract on this one, where the B101 essentially states that the architect shall consider sustainable design alternatives, such as material choices, building orientation, with other considerations based on program and aesthetics. Essentially, what it does not state is that the architect must always, in every case, and for every project, inquire about sustainable design alternatives. So it essentially obligates us to consider sustainable design alternatives, which leaves the door open for us to understand if we have a functioning and historical relationship with that client, that we know they're not interested in sustainable design strategies, we do not have to ask it every single time. So even though it's in the contract and literally that contract for that project may be interpreted to require that, that's not the case in this example. So that's an example of adaptive reasoning. Um, Going forward, I'd like to highlight the fact that most ARE item calculations are simple arithmetic. There are very few formulas that have anything besides addition, subtraction, a little bit of multiplication, and a little bit of division. Um, so this example here, simple arithmetic, your firm has staff utilization that is very low, and the firm is placing numerous resources on filling up staff utilization to avoid layoffs. The staffing capacity can handle $1 million worth of project workload, with 4 proposals currently on the table with varying degrees of certainty of being awarded the project. How much more fee in dollars can the staff handle? So this is trying to keep staff, our volume of staff stable. How much project work can we take on to be able to not have to have any layoffs? So essentially, this is the revenue projection for this question. What I want to point out is that for questions like this, there are 2 things I would like to highlight for you today. So first is simple arithmetic. That one's pretty basic. But I also want to highlight the fact that when you're studying for these exams, try not to focus on specific formats. You know, like this may be colored, it may be highlighted, it may be black and white, it may be a simple Excel spreadsheet that's essentially copy and pasted or directly out of a textbook example. So what I would advise you for these to prepare for these kinds of questions is essentially to practice how to find the right information that you need, not trying to learn how to read a specific format. So that's kind of some background information on this one. But essentially that information exists right here. We have that goal of $1 million. Currently, we have 145,000 in existing projects. We have 419,000 in proposals that are out, and we have projections here of 150 and 150. So that calculation is very basic. You add them all together, get $864,000. You subtract that from $1 million, and our value that we can basically support $136,000 in additional project load for this question. So that would get us to the correct answer. So those 2 questions were sort of centric on practice management. And so the next 2 example questions are going to be more geared toward project management. So I want to stress, especially with project management, that the contracts are incredibly important. And then secondarily, I want to stress that ARE items are highly contract sensitive. This essentially means that while some elements of the ARE have kind of moved closer to like practice logic, some sort of really haven't, in the sense that like contracts really do override and dominate a lot of your responses. And here's an example of that. An architect's mechanical engineer has completed the HVAC replacement drawings for an HVAC replacement project. Per AIA B101, who's responsible for the submission of the HVAC drawings to the owner? General practice principles would say that we as the architect are the primary client point of contact, but you may be thinking to yourself when you read this question, well, it's an all mechanical project and the mechanical engineer did the drawings, so the mechanical engineer can simply submit the drawings, right? However, in the B101, it states in section 3.2.7 that the architect shall submit the schematic design documents. Section 3.3.3, the architect shall submit the design development documents. And Section 3.4.5, the architect shall submit the construction documents. And so this is critically important to know that what we do in practice isn't always what is the correct answer on the exam. So I have another sort of narrative example of this too, where I worked on a project that was in Idaho. I'm located in California. And the structural engineer was doing, I think it was either an addendum that needed to be submitted to the city. I believe it was an addendum. Um, and so obviously I'm holding the primary contract, but in this case, it was just more logistically feasible for the structural engineer to go in and do that, right? So we do that for each other as professional courtesies or just what's logistically most functional. Sometimes going into the city, the owner just takes the drawings too. But in this particular case, the question stated AIA B101. That means that you strictly and specifically have to follow what the contract says you should do. And so the correct answer here is going to be the architect, even if it's an all mechanical project and there isn't any architectural scope. And for our second example, I want to talk about how ARE items do require sound judgment. And this is probably the hardest thing for especially fresh ARE candidates who are just getting used to the way that this exam really tests these concepts. It's that dreaded question you get that says, please select the best option of these 6 options. And you read them and you think to yourself, well, 3 of them actually seem like pretty good options. So that's what this concept is about. It's about the ARE requiring judgment. You have to pick the best possible option. And here's an example. It has to do with liability. 1 year after completion of an office building, the owner has purchased a second site for another office building. The owner intends to use the same drawings and specifications without the architect. So, what information should the architect provide the owner? The answer options here, I'm going to read through them because we're going to kind of analyze them as a group and work through how to find the correct answer. So the first being contact information for a construction manager, a letter of consent to reuse the documents, notice that the architect holds no liability for the plans reuse, sustainability criteria and energy models, and communicate that the owner may not reuse the plans, and a version of the plans with not for construction to the owner. This is really critical because finding the best response really strictly has to do with what the architect takes on legally in the contract. And remember that take note of the fact that contracts only exist for that specific scope. That actually should say the B101, sorry for that typo up top. But in the B101, it says that the architect grants to the owner a non-exclusive license to use the architect's instruments of service solely and exclusively for purposes of constructing, using, maintaining, altering, and adding to the project. It also goes on to say that in the event that the owner uses instruments of service without retaining the authors of the instruments of service, the owner releases the architect and the architect's consultants from all claims and causes of action arising from such uses. And it has some additional information in there that also relates to how that works contractually and legally speaking, but these are the operative excerpts from those 2 sections. But let's go back to those answer options and work through which one's correct and why. The correct answer is notice that the architect holds no liability for the plan's reuse. This is important. Essentially, that's what those sections are saying. But let's go through the other answer options and see why they're not correct. And we're going to talk about some pretty intricate legalese about it, but essentially on answer option A, sending contact information for a construction manager, while you can do that, it doesn't really do anything to, sort of protect the risk that your firm would have, or your project team, or even your consultants would have on that project. The sending a letter of consent to reuse the documents is just not correct, because legally you cannot have those documents be reused. You've already agreed to them under contract that they cannot be reused. Plus, risk management wise, you wouldn't really want to do that anyway, because different site conditions, and it's a different site, so you can't really reuse the same project that easily. Um, Option D, sustainability criteria and energy models. Yeah, you could send them over, but it sort of falls in the same boat as answer option A for contact information for a construction manager. Before I go on to the next ones, I do just want to highlight those three. They, while they may be things that you can, with the exception of B, actually, a letter of consent to sorry, I was thinking of a different answer. So all three of those things are essentially implying, without stating it in the case of A and D, they are implying that you may reuse these plans by not saying that you cannot. Um, so of the top four, notice that the architect holds no liability is obviously the correct one. Now the last two, communicate that the owner may not reuse the plans. Seems like a viable option. And then answer option F, version of the plans with not for construction to the owner. That is, both of those are options that maybe you could do. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, I want to be helpful. I want to help my client in some way, but I don't want to take responsibility. So I'm going to slap not for construction on this plan and send it over and let them do what they want. And then communicate that the owner may not reuse the plans. It is something that you could do. You could simply state that. However, contractually speaking, what those things are not doing is they're not really adhering to how contractual law works, in the sense that they're really non-functional responses, because what you're trying to do in answer option E and F is control the actions of another person through a legal agreement, but you're trying to control actions outside of the scope of that legal agreement. And so that may incite a few questions about how that works, but really we can only comment on, the correct answer is to only comment on what the scope of the existing agreement is, which is that we hold no liability for the plan's reuse. So that's kind of the basics on that one. Um, that's sort of the run through on project management, and we previously did some practice management questions. I can go back to any of the content if you guys have any specific questions about anything I've spoken about so far. And we can get as macro or micro scale with this analysis as we want to, but I'd like to open up the floor to questions if y'all have any.
Yeah, and Kevin, we actually do have one on the last question.
Mhm.
Mario says that C is correct, but it gives permission to use the plants. If you could clarify a little bit more on that.
Sorry, what was the question?
If you can pull up the last question, essentially
Yes.
C was the correct answer, but it seems that it gives permissions to use the plants. That's what Mario wants to double check. And Mario, feel free to unmute if you want to add to that.
I can comment on it if she doesn't want to add. So it, while not saying that you cannot, saying that we hold no liability adheres to the agreement that we made in the contract. So if we go back to here, Um, it's saying that the architect grants to the owner a non-exclusive license to use the architect's instruments of service solely and exclusively for purposes of constructing, using, maintaining, altering, and adding to the project. And in terms of legal language, um, this is probably really important for everyone in the room. If you don't have a lot of experience with contracts, um, when something is capitalized, it is a proper noun related to the definitions and terms of that contract. So the word project being capitalized means that it is speaking about this project. And so the design drawings, the instruments of service are licensed only for this project in that section. Does that clarify it?
Um, Hi, this is Mario. It just
Okay.
I'm a little bit unclear when it says there that we don't hold liability for the plans and send it to the owner. So the owner has the option to take the plans and do the construction?
Well, think of it this way. Practically speaking, we deliver to the owner our product, which is a set of plans. We actually have a responsibility to keep our plans on record, essentially, to keep an archive of our plans, I think, for up to 10 years in most jurisdictions. And that's not only in case we get sued, so we have a record of what we did, but also to have a record for anyone that needs to inquire about it if there's a good reason to do so. As a firm management strategy and a service strategy, you may want to keep your plans well organized and readily accessible for owners to grab and reference however they want. Um, so if I send you a PDF and I say you may use this PDF only for this one thing, you still have that PDF. I can't control what you do outside of the terms of our agreement. Um, I can only control what our agreement is, and in that agreement, I take responsibility for that PDF used for that purpose. What you do with that PDF after the terms of our agreement are terminated is beyond the scope of my control. It's beyond the scope of the agreement, and therefore I cannot do anything about it besides to remind you of what I agreed to in the contract and the scope that it applies to. Does that clarify it?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks. Do we have other questions?
Not by now, but everybody, please feel free to raise your hands and I can unmute you or put a question in the chat if you're being shy. Kevin has a lot of knowledge and he's here to share it.
Thank you. Yeah, practice and project management is one of the more interesting ones. I do kind of want to go back to in terms of giving more general advice while we're waiting for some questions to pop in. The Architect's Handbook of Professional Practice is a fantastic resource for this exam. It it outlines very clearly and simply the concepts that were being tested on. And one of the things I think I did not go through when we talked about the exam setup is how the exam items are written. I don't know how new everyone is in this room to the concepts of the exam and how it's written, but basically, this exam is written using these resources. So NCARB essentially gave you in the matrix a list of all of the books that the volunteers who are writing these questions are writing them from. So, get your hands on the critical books that are outlined there. They have an asterisk on the ones that are most important. I would say at the very least, get those books. But there are also some fantastic other books that will help you sort of broaden your knowledge. But for this exam, unlike other exams on the ARE, this exam really only requires the Architect's Handbook of Professional Practice. It's such a fantastic resource for it.
Still no questions specific to the testing material, but I did want to ask, I guess, for
Mhm.
everybody to know, would you recommend a testing strategy in terms of, do all the case studies first, do the multiple questions first, or I don't know what worked
Um,
for you?
I have some advice on that. Yes. So I know that time is really of the essence. Whether or not you do the case studies first or later doesn't really matter in my opinion. It's more that you're widely aware of how much time you're spending on each question. There may be questions that require you to read a lot. And if you read through a question once and it didn't make any sense to you at all, probably just move on. Because if you're going to have to read a question 4 or 5 times to even understand the language of that question, you're wasting a lot of time where you could get a more efficient answer with a lot less time, which frees you up to have the time to spend on that later. I would say you probably don't want to manage too many of those, so probably keep it to like, between 5 and 8 questions of skipping before you start to worry about that. But your critical reading is going to be important for time saving. So, uh, and then I'm trying to think of some of the best things that I've encountered with some candidates. Oh, so the check all that apply questions, especially with the removal of the um, drag and drop options, there will probably be a larger percentage of each of the types that remain. So hotspot, check all that apply, and multiple choice. The check all that apply questions take a lot of they take time and they take a lot of mental stamina. So those are ones that I think you should probably reserve some of your mental stamina for, and make those probably the ones that you would skip first if you're not fully understanding it, or if you have less than half of them stricken from possibility right off the bat. And by that I mean, like, if there are 6 answer options and it says check the 2 that apply, if you're not immediately striking out 3 of them, you may want to just come back to it later when you know you have some time.
Great. And everybody, just so you know, you can go ahead and unmute yourselves as needed for now. If anybody's having trouble raising their hand when we're not, feel free to jump in.
Kevin, sorry if you already said this and I missed it. Were there any like paid resources or anything that you used a lot while studying, even outside of this exam?
Well, I think that depends on your learning style. There are numerous resources across the industry of products that fit the way that each of us learn. For me, I did a combination. Well, first off, my personal principle was to use the source material. So I essentially got textbooks or uh, podcasts or something that I could, of people who were reviewing or talking about those textbooks or just reading them. Because for me, that was the best way for me to get to the source information. However, we have learners that are auditory, we have tactile learners, and we have visual learners, right? Those are our 3 basic styles of learning. I think that it's probably worth your time to spend a bit of time really looking introspectively, figuring out which ways that you learn and learn best, and trying to target certain products that serve that. And I've talked in another session with AI East Bay, so if you want to reference that video, I can find it for you and send it out. But we did a presentation where we talked about the different types of materials that are out there, and how to try and strategize which ones are best for you. So, for instance, if you're a visual and auditory learner, you're going to want something that's like an online course, right? Like a class that you could follow along with. If you're tactile, you might want to go find a study group, because you're going to be talking with people, and you may actually work through some questions, like building the question and then dissecting the question and analyzing each of the answer options. And I consider that tactile in this context. So I would hesitate to say anything in particular besides, find out what your learning styles are, and find multiple ways of serving that. And I think pretty much everybody, like, if, let's say, you think you're not really an auditory learner, work some of that in anyway. because diversifying the influences that you have help you learn from different directions. And I forget the terminology for it right now, but there is the latest research on learning science is essentially that learning from two different sources, two different modalities at the same time is actually exponentially better for you in terms of retention of the content than just learning from one alone, like reading from a textbook, for instance. Does that answer your question?
That absolutely does. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Does anyone have any other questions? You're welcome to unmute if you want to ask a question locally. I just want to make certain before we hop off tonight.
Yeah, Kevin, Alex Rostenberg here from Bakersfield. I appreciate your time in giving us these resources and your experience with this. It means a lot.
Thank you.
With the study guides that NCARB has put out, and even I know that some people have put out guides for the Handbook of Professional Practice, off the top of your head, what are sort of the major never miss sections of this incredibly thick book that you need to know for practice management? I feel sort of, I have my own hard copy, but I feel like overwhelmed when you open that front cover and you're like, holy crap, what did I get myself into? So hearing something from you would help a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not looking at the index right now off the top of my head, but it's when I say that the Architect's Handbook of Professional Practice is written very clearly and simply, it truly is. So when you're reading through the concepts in the NCARB matrix, all the objectives, you can basically cross-reference those objectives with the index of the Architect's Handbook of Professional Practice and see the correlation. For practice management, you're definitely going to want to focus on the sections that are, I believe there's a whole chapter just on business strategy and marketing and stuff like that. So that's really important. You're going to need to focus on, fringe benefits and insurance and all the things that are required of a firm to be able to operate and reduce risk. I'm speaking specifically for practice management at the moment. And then you're definitely going to want to study the section on firm structures and business models. Those are probably the two critical subchapters that you're going to want to put a good amount of time into, because knowing the difference between an expertise-based firm and operating as an LLC, or well, I guess in California you can't do an LLC, but like knowing the differences between like an expertise-based firm that's functioning as an LLC in another jurisdiction, or a S corp that is like I forget the term for it now, actually, but it's basically a geographical location firm where you're trying to get projects with different office locations. Those are the types of sort of like firm management and visioning sections that you're going to want to dig into. Whereas for project management, it's a lot more what most of us are seeing on our day-to-day, which is looking at firm resources, staffing, how to basically do work planning and projections of profitability, that sort of thing.
Great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. And those guides, they're all of us content creators who are helping you out and passing your exams. We've gone through it all with a fine-tooth comb. And again, I don't have it right in front of me, or else I'd be able to just list them all out for you. But we've all really analyzed that book, because it is kind of the only book for this exam, and it's good. So pretty much all of those guides are almost identical, and they all have the information you need.
Excellent. Thanks again for your time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any other questions? Probably have time for one more. All right.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And everybody, our next session is on 5/19. So if you haven't signed up for that one, please make sure you do so. It's on a different exam, but equally valuable. So yeah, so the recording will go onto our unlisted playlist. And you guys will get an email when the recording goes out. I see some people asking in the chat. But thank you everybody so much. And thank you, Kevin, for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you
I'll see
very
you
much.
all around,
So,
and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thanks.